So, Vince Cerf again. This has to do with the difference between the criminal and the victim. It seems to me that our justice system may deal with the criminals, but they don't deal very well with remuneration for the victims. What's wrong with that system?
Well, that's why we have, if there's an attorney who wants to step in and save me, now is the time. But my understanding is that's why we have the civil system. That if there's to be compensation, you take it to the civil courts. But you're absolutely right. The laws do not tell us what to do about the victims, but rather tell us what to do with the perpetrators. One footnote to that, there are attempts now to have perpetrators and victims talk to one another as a way of sort of reconciling their differences. And there's some indication that that helps both parties do better. But, I mean, what are you going to do with a homicide, right? So.
It strikes me that there are some very interesting and problematic skews in the data that you're working with. So, for one, if you decide not to release a person, then you never find out whether they would have committed a crime. So you only find out for the people you do decide to release, who are presumably, well, that's one issue. And then the other, of course, is that there could be regularities in the historical data that you have that are based on, let's say, inappropriate biases, racial biases, for example. And those will be reflected in empirical regularities in that data set. And so if the question I'm interested in is whether you have good ideas about how to deal with this, with those kinds of skews in the data sample that you have, given that you'd like to, move toward a regime with less inappropriate biases.
Okay. Answer to the first question, we've solved it. It turns out that in many jurisdictions, individuals are assigned at random to judges. Judges vary in whether they're hanging judges or liberal judges. So you have a randomized experiment across 30 judges. Some detain individuals that others wouldn't, and vice versa. There's your comparison. So we can look and see what would happen if we do have that information. That's a design that's been used quite frequently, I guess, for about 10 years now. There are other, by the way, steps in the criminal justice system which are quite similar. For example, when individuals are being prosecuted by different prosecutors or assigned defense attorney, it's effectively random. On the issue of bias, I couldn't agree more. Any variable that well, maybe you could come up with a variable. I can't think of a variable in which there isn't a correlation with either race or gender. That's the way the world is. I mean, there's nothing we can do about it. That's in the data. What we can try to do is what I mentioned. We can try to remove it at the beginning. We can try in the process build into the algorithm some fairness adjustment which penalizes lack of fairness. Or we can try to correct it at the end, again, by jiggering who is sent to prison and who is not. There are always going to be accuracy trade-offs for that, but that's a way of removing the bias, we think, pretty effectively. But is it always going to be in the data? Absolutely. And then I come back to my initial point. The judges are acting the same way. I mean, again, it's compared to the historical actions. You're right, the historical practice may be unacceptable, but we're living with it with the judges too. And the question is, can we be less biased and more accurate? We hope so.
I loved your talk, really. It's an amazingly candid discussion. I think this is a very nice thing to have. And I think making the balances, the trade-offs being made public so that we can talk about it, that reminds me of this old Columbia School of Journalism seminar thing, that not to make your decisions, but to make decision-making so intense that you can escape only by thinking. So if you make this public, you can decide whether or not it's 3 times more costly to release somebody versus take the brunt. I do want to just add one little anecdote point, which is there is also, to justice in general, there is this beautiful saying that justice should not only be done, but should be seen to be done. And sometimes that actually plays in. I had a personal experience back in 2005, right after the tube bombings in London. I happened to be in London. And, people who sort of look like me apparently were involved. And, UK, of course, cannot really directly say, we'll just stop brown people. And so most of the time I was not stopped. There was one time I was alone, so they stopped me. And I was thinking, yeah, this is random. And then just to make me feel good, I guess, they really got this really old 85-year-old a British white woman, and then they frisked her too. And I felt extremely good that day, that this is a very safe place, So I wonder, I mean, that sort of goes back to your question about do we level up or level down. In some cases, there may be a way of doing this in such a way that basically the feeling that the justice is being served is actually felt by the population. I think that's something that's wrong.
Well, those are very good points. You're also implicitly raising the question we've talked about a little already, and that's transparency. We've thought a lot about that. I've talked to philosophers and legal scholars about it, and I didn't want to ask questions earlier because it's not clear what that means. But it's a discussion that needs to go on, and I think insofar as we can make algorithms more transparent, Cynthia is an example. To the degree to which we can do things like that and build in fairness, we may be able to have something that policymakers will like. But I have to go back to say, when I testify, let's say before Philadelphia City Council on this, and I say, you can't have accuracy and fairness optimized. And they say, we want accuracy and fairness. I say, no. You can't have accuracy and fairness. And they say, we want accuracy and fairness. I say, no. And we go back and forth. And of course, the reason is these individuals have campaigned on a promise of accuracy and fairness, and they can't make public statements to the contrary. Afterwards, over a couple of beers, we make some progress. But in public, it's very, very hard to get that kind of recognition that you're emphasizing. Yes.
Well, first, thank you for your talk. Very, very candid. So are you afraid of self-fulfilling prophecy problems? I think there's a book that came out called Weapons of Mass Destruction. Yes. An example is given is, well, if you look at crime by zip code and you send more police to the zip code, you will find more crime in the zip code, and it will kind of keep going at it. So that sounds like an even harder problem than just biases in data. It's just like your decisions will make these biases even stronger, right?
Well, okay, there's a whole other series of issues you've raised about policing, but let me just sort of throw in one fact. It's not an alternative fact, by the way. It is certainly true that where you put more police, there are more police-citizens interactions, both good and bad. It's easy, right? So the next question is, how are police deployed? And the main driver for police deployments are calls for service, 911. So they are disproportionately in high-crime neighborhoods, but people are asking for the police. And by the way, if you do a survey, they want the police there. And then there are going to be more good things. The police are going to do wonderful things, and a few are going to do things that aren't so good. Sure. The police are going to be more visible, more active. Good things happen, bad things happen, but they are called there by the people who need the service. Is that an example of bias, or is it just a reaction of the citizens' desire for safety?
Yeah, I was not talking about a specific example. I was more about this idea of self-fulfilling prophecy, right? Because the decision is made based on an algorithm may basically change the data that's used to train the algorithm, right? And then you get this kind of bad feedback loop, right?
Well, but let me go back. Yes, but let me go back to the beginning. Our primary job is public safety. Okay? If crimes are being committed in certain neighborhoods disproportionately, and our primary job is public safety, what's wrong with reinforcing sending the police where the crimes are? And then what happens? Happens. More good things happen. Lots of good things happen. Some bad things happen too. It doesn't necessarily reflect bias. It might, but we're just responding to calls for service. So I guess I can see in principle that you're absolutely right. In practice, I'm not sure. Maybe I'm missing the point that you're making.
Hi, thank you for your talk. That was really good to hear. Just two. So really,
I'm ready.
just two quick questions
Yeah.
or comments even. So one is the asymmetric value of different data pieces. So for example, and the impossibility of providing it to an algorithm. So for example, has an individual attended an alcohol or a drug rehabilitation program, and how do you factor that in? But if everyone hasn't done it, then you can't include it. So that brings me to the second point, which is context, contextualizing the algorithm or the score or whatever thing you have going. And I think there's a profound role for context here, where you have training on how to use the algorithm, how to interpret it, and how a human at the other end of that algorithm, or a group of humans at the other end of that algorithm, or even a society at the end of that algorithm, can say, okay, well, here are other factors we can add in to make our decisions, and here's how we can do it in a fair and transparent manner that's equitable. So those are my comments.
Okay, let me talk context, because again, there may be some misunderstanding how these things are used. In all of my experience, we've never had a circumstance where the algorithmic forecast was definitive. Okay?
Right.
By law, for example, parole board is required to use discretion. Judges the same way. So this is another piece of information we add. They can do with it what they want. They can flush it down the toilet, or they can treat it definitively. It's strictly up to them. What I recommend is that they use this as their best forecast. There are other instruments out there. Those of you who know this literature know there's something called the LSIR, there's Compass, there's other instruments out there. We've already shown we're more accurate than they. Use that. But then things, as you quite correctly point out, evolve, let's say in a hearing. You learn that someone has a full-time job, has 2 kids at home, and this was probably a mistake. Anything that's not in the algorithm should now be added in and used judgmentally. At some point, when we have better data, that would be in the data set. But until we do, we shouldn't ignore that other information, because explicitly it's not included. And we encourage judges to do that. We encourage parole boards to do it, and it seems to work pretty well.
Right, and it's a broader issue with all of this. It's in all the different contexts, whether it's financial or education, et cetera.
Yeah, the point is to provide better information about risk.
Right.
What the decision maker does with that's not my job, thank God. Somebody else has to decide who goes to jail and who doesn't. But ideally, they use all sorts of information of the sort you described. Yeah.
I'm Peter Stone from UT Austin, so thanks for your talk.
Yeah.
You ended with you can't have everything,
Yes.
and I think that's a really important observation that you backed up theoretically, and I think it leads also to the perspective that's very important. You pointed out that we need to expose the trade-offs and make conscious decisions about the trade-offs, and that leads to a whole series of interesting, technical machine learning problems that we're all very interested in. But I think the most important slide is a community that was where you started, that we can talk all we want amongst ourselves, but from the perspective of doing the best possible good for society, we need to keep drilling in that message of compared to what.
Yes.
Right, and we can't have everything in an algorithm. We also can't have everything in a person. That same theory applies to people, and so the relevant question is how much better can we do? And once we can do better, we should start. We have to make the case that it's a better outcome, even if it's not perfect, if it's better than people, if we have the algorithms helping us with the decision. So I just wanted to, this isn't really a question, but a comment that I really appreciate where you started from, and I think that's an important message we need to keep touch with.
Thank you very much. I don't often get support, so thank you for that. One final thing. Michael and I and Aaron Roth have a draft of a paper that's being reviewed on this stuff. There's a lot more material on the algorithms that Michael and others are developing to try to build in these knobs on fairness. And if you email me, I ask Michael if it's okay, I'm happy to send you the paper.
Yeah, one quick question.
Sorry, let me just jump in with one comment on Peter's comment, which is, I think it's important to remember it's not only compared to what is baseline human performance, but one of the additional burdens that gets placed on algorithms is the fact that you can measure, because you have to specify kind of what you would output on any input. You can sort of measure many things about algorithms that we just don't know how to measure about the way humans make decisions, right? So for instance, you can kind of sketch out an entire curve of the trade-off between whatever your favorite definition of fairness and accuracy is, but you can only, you can't ask people to specify how they would make those same trade-offs, right? You can only ask them at best and not even this always, but you can only ask them, well, what would you do in this particular case? And then it's easy for them to sort of overfit some post hoc explanation for why that's fair or a good trade-off, for instance. And I think Richard knows this work very well from judges being asked these kinds of questions, like, what's the ratio you want of false positives to false negatives? And so I'm not, I don't think that this is a reason to forgive algorithms for their behavior, but we just have to remember they face a lot just because when you write down a program, you're specifying not just what you would do on the cases presented to you, but on basically every case off the path of reality as well.
I'll point out that that's also the case for self-driving cars, which we talked about earlier. We can't put a human through exactly the case where all past accidents have happened, but we can with cars. And so this is both an opportunity and a burden that the algorithms face.
Yeah, there's one footnote to that. One of our colleagues at Penn has made this point to us several times, which is there's a specificity that Michael is pointing to, which does not exist in a legal context. The law just isn't that specific, and that's another discussion, but there's good reasons why it's vague. And that's going to always lead to a sort of communications problem that we're trying to bridge, and others are as well, but it's going to take some time. And it's sort of matching a very specific set of ideas to more general jurisprudence, which is kind of vague.
Yeah, one quick question. So it seems from my understanding that we can always have transparency, but the fairness and the accuracy part, you have to do trade-off. So let's lead it to the question, should we introduce this interpretability? So once the machine, they come to the case, saying, I'm not exactly sure about this case, but this is the evidence I have, then give that to the human being, and then let the human being make a decision there.
Well, this was a question I was going to ask earlier, then I sat down because I didn't want to get into it. But there are some really tricky epistemological problems about what you mean when you say explain or interpret. It's not easy. I've talked to philosophers about this, and I just come away with a headache. It's very hard to make sense of that. If someone here, and I'd love to hear it, has a way of clarifying why one explanation is better, more interpretable, or explains better than another, I'd love to hear it. It's not obvious to me how you would define that. I've asked that to my lawyer friends and my philosophers. Say, a judge requires, when a decision, let's say in civil court or something, an administrative decision is made, the government has to justify it, has to explain why. So I say, what do you mean explain why? And the answer is whatever the judge accepts.
Thanks.
Okay, please join me in thanking Richard again and also all of today's